cracked earth. The drought had held for 6 weeks, and the land was done pretending. Creek beds lay bare as bone. The garden rows Kent Reeves had planted in April curled brown at their edges, leaves thin as paper, roots clutching at soil that gave back nothing. He stood at the well that morning and dropped the bucket, listening to the rope unspool, counting the seconds before it hit water. Took longer every day now. The rope burned his palms on the way back up, hemp fibers catching in the splits that ran down his knuckles and across his lifelines like tiny rivers with nothing left to carry. No amount of tallow seemed to mend them anymore. Daisy sat on the porch rail, bare feet swinging against the post. Tommy crouched in the dirt beside her, drawing shapes with a stick that left pale scratches in the hard pan. "Papa, is she nice?" Daisy asked. "Don't know yet, sweetheart. We'll find out together." He'd placed an advertisement for a tutor 3 weeks back. The nearest schoolhouse sat 11 miles east, and he couldn't spare the wagon that often. A woman had answered letters so precise, it read like a legal document. Penmanship so clean, it made his own handwriting look like fence wire in a windstorm. The afternoon stage arrived late, trailing dust that hung in the air like smoke from a fire nobody could find. A woman stepped down, carrying a single carpet bag. She was mid-20s, maybe, with dark hair pinned tight beneath a bonnet and a dress that had been mended more than once at the hem. Her name was Violet Carter. What Kent noticed first was her eyes. They moved before the rest of her did. She scanned the porch, the doorway, the yard, the distance between the house and the road. She measured everything twice. Kent had spent 15 years reading horses, and horses had taught him that fear lived in the body long before it reached the eyes. "Miss Carter," he stepped forward and extended his hand. "Welcome to—" She flinched. It was small, a tightening of the shoulders, a half step backward, a breath caught and held like something fragile she was afraid to drop. His hand hung in the empty air between them. He lowered it slowly. "Much obliged you made the trip," he said, keeping his voice the way he kept it around Greenbrook Colt, steady, low, no sudden edges. "Children been looking forward to meeting you." "Thank you, Mr. Reeves." Her voice was level, polite. She picked up her own bag before he could offer again. Here's what Kent noticed that first afternoon. Though he'd never say it aloud, she stood the way a person stands when they've learned that rooms have corners you can't see out of. Every doorway was a calculation. Every offered hand was a question that had already been answered for her before she'd had the chance to speak. That night, after supper, which Violet took alone on the porch, declining the family table with a smile that touched her mouth but went no further, Kent walked past her room on the way to check the children. He heard the bolt slide. Then a pause, long enough to hold a breath. Then the second bolt. He stood in the hallway listening to the silence behind that door, and something settled in his chest that he couldn't name. Not pity, something heavier, something that felt like standing at the edge of a river you know you can't cross yet, watching someone stranded on the other side. The distance she keeps. Second week of June. Violet Carter had a system for rooms. She'd learned it the way other women learn to preserve peaches, through necessity, through repetition, through the kind of practice that becomes invisible once it's deep enough. Every room she entered, she measured 3 things before her second breath: distance to the nearest door, weight of the latch, and how many strides it would take a grown man to cross from the far wall to where she stood. She ate on the porch. Not because the food was poor. Kent cooked plain but honest. Salt pork and biscuits, beans with molasses that Tommy ate with his fingers when his father wasn't looking. She ate on the porch because the porch had 3 directions to move and the kitchen table put her back to the doorway. The children were different. Children were safe the way creek water was safe, clear all the way through. incapable of pretending to be something other than what they were. Daisy was 7, sharp-eyed and relentless with questions that tumbled out faster than she could catch them. Tommy was 5, quieter, content to sit beside Violet during lessons and trace the letters she drew on the slate with a focus that made his tongue press against his lower lip. On the 4th day, during a reading lesson on the porch, Daisy reached over and curled her fingers around Violet's hand. Violet's breath stopped. Her body went still, that old stillness, the kind that comes before running, the kind that knows the weight of a latch and the width of a door and exactly how many strides it takes to reach it. But Daisy's hand was small, warm. It held on without squeezing, without pulling, without agenda. Violet let out the breath. She did not pull away. At the general store that Saturday, Mrs. Harlan looked Violet up and down with the careful appraisal of a woman who inventories other women the way shopkeepers inventory stock. "And where did you say you were from, dear?" "I didn't," Violet said. Mrs. Harlan's smile had a bolt on it. "Same as any door." "Well, small town like this, people do wonder." That evening, Violet sat at the family table for the first time, back to the wall, hands in her lap. She accepted the plate Kent set before her and did not flinch when his shadow crossed the lamplight. It was not much, but she was there. "Papa, why is Miss Violet always scared?" Late June, lamplight turned Daisy's hair to copper. She lay in her nightgown, quilt pulled to her chin, and her voice came out the way important things always come out of children, quiet, without rehearsal, and impossible to unhear. "Papa, why is Miss Violet always scared?" Kent set down the storybook. "What makes you think that, sweetheart?" "She jumps when you come in a room. She checks the door at night. I hear her slide the bolt 2 times. Daisy's brow furrowed with the particular seriousness of a child working through something too large for her years. "And she wraps her arms around herself when Mr. Tucker passes on the road. Like she's cold." "Papa, but it ain't cold." Kent was quiet for a long time. The lamp hissed softly. Outside, the drought pressed its heat against the windows like a hand laid flat on glass. "Some people been hurt, Daisy," he said finally. "Not hurt like a skinned knee, hurt in a way that makes the whole world feel unsafe. We can't fix that kind of hurt by asking about it. We fix it by being the kind of people she don't need to be scared of. How do we do that? We're gentle, we're patient. We let her decide when she's ready." Daisy considered this with the gravity of a circuit judge. "Like when Tommy found that bird with the broke wing and you said we couldn't hold it. We just had to put food near it and wait." Kent's throat tightened until he couldn't speak. He nodded. "Okay, Papa, I can do that." After she slept, he sat on the edge of his own bed in the dark. He could hear the house settling, the tick of cooling timber, the faint wind pressing against the eaves. He thought about Violet's face when he'd reached for her carpet bag that first day, the way her whole body had pulled inward, like a flower closing against frost. He looked at his hands, calloused, scarred from fence wire and axe handles and 15 years of work that had no end in sight. These hands could build a barn. They could snap a board clean in two. They could gentle a horse, or haul a well bucket, or hold a child steady on a saddle. Tomorrow, these hands would learn a different kind of strength. He would knock before every room. He would ask before handing her anything. He would keep the distance she needed, for as long as she needed it, because a man's strength meant nothing if it couldn't be still. Small safeties. July, 3 weeks in. The knocking started on a Tuesday, and Violet noticed it immediately because no man had ever knocked for her before. Every door, every time. 2 knocks, a pause, and then he waited. He waited for her voice before he entered. If she didn't answer right away, he waited longer. He never tested the silence. He never turned the handle to check. It took her 3 days to stop bracing at the sound. By the end of the first week, her shoulders stayed level when his knuckles found the wood. Then he started doing other things. He'd set her plate on the table instead of handing it to her, no reaching across her space, no accidental brush of fingers. When something needed passing during lessons, he'd place it on the desk between them and step back. "That's there for you, Miss Carter, whenever you'd like it." Always the asking, always the space. Can I tell you what that does to a woman who's spent years mapping the distance between herself and every door in every room she's ever entered? It unmakes the map. Slowly, the way spring unmakes ice, not in a single crack, but in 1,000 small surrenders. One room at a time. Violet found herself forgetting to count the strides from wall to door. She found herself sitting at the table without pressing her spine against the wood behind her. The drought deepened. The garden curled tighter despite Kent hauling water from the creek 2 miles east. He left before dawn and returned with bleeding hands and full pails and never once asked for sympathy. Mrs. Harlan arrived one afternoon with 3 churchwomen in tow. Their faces carried the particular expression of people who believe their disapproval is Christian duty. "People are talking, Mr. Reeves. Mabel Price says she's seen that girl hanging wash before dawn in her nightclothes. Now I ain't one to judge, but a young unmarried woman under your roof with your children, it ain't seemly." Kent's hand tightened on the pail handle, knuckles whitening against the wood. A muscle moved along his jaw, but when he spoke, his voice was the same steady line it always was. "She's teachin' my children to read, Mrs. Harlan. She's welcome here long as she cares to stay. I'm only sayin' I heard what you said." He held the gate open. "Much obliged for your concern." That evening he poured water at the supper table, filled Tommy's glass first, then Daisy's. Then he turned to Violet and said, "May I pour you one, Miss Carter?" The asking, always the asking. "Yes," she said. "Thank you, Mr. Reeves." It was the first time she'd held his gaze for longer than a heartbeat. What safe love looks like. Late July, 6 weeks in, Tommy brought her wildflowers on a Wednesday. He didn't announce it or wait for permission or look for approval. He appeared in the middle of a reading lesson, set a fistful of black-eyed Susans on Violet's primer book, and said, "These are for you, Miss Violet. I found 'em by the fence." Then he ran away laughing before she could answer. Violet held the flowers against her chest and closed her eyes. Her jaw softened. Her shoulders dropped an inch. Kent watched from the doorway far enough to be safe, close enough to see the tension leave her face the way heat leaves a stone after sundown. Daisy held Violet's hand on walks now. It had become routine, unconscious. The way children love without strategy or negotiation or the particular cruelty of conditions. She'd reach up, find Violet's fingers, and hold on while they walked the fence line or checked on the chickens. Sometimes she'd swing their arms between them, humming melodies she'd invented herself. Can I tell you what kept Kent Reeves awake those nights? Not wanting. Wanting is simple. Any fool with a pulse knows the shape of wanting. It was the terror that one wrong step, one door opened without knocking. One hand extended a half-second too soon would undo every inch she'd traveled toward safety. He was building something he couldn't see and couldn't name. And the only tool he had was patience. And some nights patience felt like holding a breath he couldn't let go. One evening during supper, Violet dropped a fork and it clattered against the table edge. She startled. Kent's hand moved toward her shoulder, instinct, pure and thoughtless, the way a man reaches for someone who's been frightened. His fingers were 6 inches from her sleeve when he caught himself. He redirected the hand to the table's edge, gripped the wood, and held on. "You're all right," he said softly. Nothing more. Violet looked at his hand on the table. She looked at the distance between it and her shoulder. She understood what had happened, what he'd almost done, and what he'd chosen instead. The well dropped another foot that week. Kent hauled water before dawn, rope sawing into hands that hadn't healed from yesterday's hauling. By supper time his knuckles were raw and weeping. After the children went to bed, he found a small jar of salve beside his plate. No note, no word, just calendula and beeswax in a clay pot, set exactly where he would find it without anyone having to hand it to him. She had seen him. Across all that careful distance, she had seen him. He rubbed the salve into his palms and felt the sting ease for the first time in weeks. And something in his chest opened that he hadn't realized was closed. Theft. August. 2 months in. The letter arrived on a Tuesday. Violet took it from the postmaster's hand and read it standing in the street. By the second line, her hands were trembling so hard the paper rattled like a cottonwood leaf in wind. She did not tell Kent what the letter said. She burned it in the cook stove, watching the edges curl black and the ink vanish into ash. And she stood there until the last ember winked out. That evening, Kent found her on the porch steps, crying. Not the loud kind, the silent kind, the kind that rises from a place so deep it has forgotten how to make sound. He sat down beside her, not too close, a full arm's length between them, the same distance he'd kept for 8 weeks, the distance that had become its own language between them. He rested his elbows on his knees and folded his cracked hands together and waited. The sky purpled. Stars appeared one at a time, the way they do when nobody is watching for them. There was a man, Violet said. Her voice was barely a whisper. In my old town. Kent did not move. He stole something from me. She pulled her arms tight around herself. That old gesture, armor made of bone. My first kiss. He took it behind the church after Sunday service. I was 17. He held my face so I couldn't turn away. Her breath shuddered. And then he told everyone I'd wanted it. Told the whole town I was the one who that I had been. Her voice fractured like dry wood. I didn't want it. I didn't choose it. But after he said what he said, everyone looked at me like I wasn't there anymore. Like I'd been erased. The night sounds rose around them. Crickets pulsing in the grass. A coyote, far off, singing to no one. The creak of the porch boards under their weight. That wasn't a kiss, Kent said quietly. That was theft. 5 words. He didn't reach for her. He didn't promise to find the man or deliver justice or make it right. He didn't try to solve what couldn't be solved with hands, no matter how strong. He sat in the space beside her and named the truth she'd carried alone for 8 years. And the naming was enough. Here's what Violet understood in that moment. Though she could not have spoken it aloud, this man had just returned to her the first thing the other man stole. Not a kiss, not innocence, a choice. The choice to speak the truth and have someone believe her. They sat until the stars were thick as spilled flour across the black sky. Then Kent stood slowly, carefully, the way he did everything now. Good night, Miss Carter, he said. He walked inside. He did not look back. She sat on the porch a while longer, arms still wrapped around herself, but looser now, looser than they'd been in 8 years. She knew he would knock tomorrow. The well runs dry late August, 3 months in. The bucket hit stone. Kent let it hang there, swinging in the dark throat of the well. Ropes slack in his bleeding hands. No splash, no give, just the hollow knock of wood against dry rock. And the silence after. He pulled the empty bucket up and stood looking at it for a long time. The creek was 2 miles east and dropping fast. Hauling water for 4 people, the chickens, and what remained of the garden meant 2 trips a day. His hands were so raw the rope left red prints in his palms that stayed through the night. That afternoon Mrs. Harlan returned. She'd brought reinforcements, 3 women, and the weight of Reverend Thomas's expressed disapproval. It ain't just gossip anymore, Mr. Reeves, the Reverend himself has spoken on it. A young unmarried woman living under your roof, and the whole town wonderin' what kind of arrangement. I appreciate you riding out. Mrs. Harlan, Kent held the gate open. Not for welcome this time. For leaving. But who lives under my roof ain't a matter for committee. Not yours. Not the Reverend's. I reckon that's between me and God. And God ain't sent a delegation. Violet heard every word through the kitchen window. Her hands went still over the bread dough. The flour settled on her knuckles like early snow. That evening, Kent left for the creek. When he returned an hour later, hands bleeding, water sloshing in both pails, he found Violet's carpet bag on the bed, half packed. She stood beside it, folding one of two good dresses with the careful precision of someone dismantling the only life that had ever felt safe. She was the drought. She was the scandal. She was the reason his name was being spoken in church with lowered voices. She could at least stop being the reason for one of those things. She was reaching for her primer books when Daisy appeared in the doorway. The girl stood in her nightgown, hair loose around her shoulders, chin trembling. She crossed the room without a word and pressed her face into Violet's skirt and held on with both fists. "Please don't go, Miss Violet." Her voice came muffled and fierce through the fabric, raw with the kind of honesty only children can manage. "You make Papa gentle." Violet's hand stopped. "You make Papa gentle." She stood with Daisy's arms around her waist and the half-packed bag on the bed and a sentence ringing through her like a bell struck in an empty church. She had spent 8 years believing she made things worse. That her presence was a stain. A scandal. A thing that ruined. And this child, this 7-year-old girl with bare feet and tangled hair had just told her the opposite was true. She unpacked the bag. One item at a time. The dresses went back on their hooks. The salve jar returned to the shelf. The primer books stayed stacked on the desk where they belonged. When Kent came through the door, pails heavy, dust streaked with sweat across his face, Violet was standing on the porch. She didn't reach for the pails. She knew better than to reach without asking, but she held the door open and said, "Welcome home, Mr. Reeves." He stopped on the threshold. Water dripped from the pails onto the boards. Something moved across his face, not surprise, exactly, but the expression of a man who has been hauling water for months and suddenly understands why. "Thank you, Miss Carter," he said. He walked inside, and she closed the door behind them both. On her terms, September. 4 months in. The clouds had been building for 3 days, stacking along the western ridge in great bruised towers that everyone watched and nobody trusted. Promises had been broken too many times that summer. The sky owed a debt it seemed unwilling to pay. Violet stood on the porch, the same porch where she had told him about the theft, where she had cried into the silence and been answered with 5 words that changed the shape of everything she knew about men, and watched Kent split wood in the yard. She noticed something. She wasn't counting. Not the strides between them. Not the distance to the door. Not the weight of the latch behind her. For the first time in as long as she could remember, her body had stopped performing the mathematics of escape. When had it stopped? She couldn't find the day. It had happened the way seasons turn, not in a single dramatic moment but through the slow accumulation of 1,000 ordinary things. 2 knocks on a door, a plate set down, never thrust, a glass offered, never poured without asking, a hand that caught itself 6 inches from her shoulder and chose the table's edge instead. Inside the house, Tommy laughed and Daisy corrected his spelling in a voice so like her father's it made Violet's chest ache. The scratch of chalk on slate, the creak of schoolroom chairs. These were the sounds of a life she had been offered with open hands and no conditions. She stepped off the porch. Kent saw her coming. He buried the axe head in the chopping block and straightened. He did not move toward her. He did not step back. He stood the way he always stood, present, unhurried, giving her every inch of distance she might still need. She crossed the yard. The ground she had once measured in strides, she now crossed in heartbeats. She reached up and kissed him, gently, deliberately, with her hands on his jaw and her eyes open until the last possible second, because she wanted to see his face, wanted to witness the exact moment a good man received something freely given. Kent's hands stayed at his sides, instinct born from months of practice, from a discipline harder than any fence he'd ever built or any water he'd ever hauled. His fingers didn't curl. His arms didn't lift. He stood perfectly, carefully still, the way he'd stood for 4 months. The way he'd chosen to stand every single day since a 7-year-old girl asked him why the new teacher was afraid. Violet reached down. She took his hands, those cracked, split-knuckled, rope-scarred hands that had hauled water 2 miles each way and knocked on every door and never once reached for her without permission, and she placed them at her waist. His fingers trembled against the fabric of her dress. "Love asks," he whispered. "It never takes." The first drops of rain hit the dust around their boots. Then more. Then the sky opened all at once, the way a held breath finally releases when it's safe, and the water came down, and the dust turned dark, and the cracked earth began, at last, to drink. Neither of them moved. Rain. It rained for 3 days. Kent stood in the yard on the 3rd morning and listened to the well bucket hit water before the rope was half unspooled. The sound, that deep, clean splash, rang up from the stone walls like an answer to a prayer he'd stopped saying aloud months ago. The creek ran full. The garden, what survived, had begun the slow remembering of green. He stood in the same spot where he'd stood in June, when the drought was 6 weeks deep and his hands were cracked past mending, and a woman stepped off the afternoon stage and flinched at his offered hand. Same boots in the same dirt. Same man in the same yard. But the dust was mud now. And the woman was not flinching. Tommy ran past him carrying a wildflower, one of the new ones, pushing up through soil that had finally softened enough to let something grow. He held it up to the rain and let the water run down his arm, grinning with the uncomplicated joy of a child who doesn't yet know that some seasons almost don't end. Daisy sat on the porch rail with Violet, their hands intertwined the way they'd been for weeks now, easy, habitual, the particular kind of holding that happens when two people have forgotten there was ever a time they didn't. Kent looked down at his own hands. Still calloused, still scarred. The cracks had begun to close now that the rope burns had time to heal, but the marks were there and would stay. These hands had hauled water 4 miles a day for an entire summer. They had gripped axe handles and fence posts and well ropes until the blood came through. They had learned to knock on doors they could have opened. They had learned to set things down instead of handing them over. They had learned to stay at a man's sides when every instinct in his body told them to reach. They had learned, in the end, that the strongest thing they could do was nothing at all, and to hold that nothing until a woman who had been erased by a man's hands felt safe enough to take them on her own terms. Violet came down the porch steps. She took his hands, both of them, lacing her fingers through his the way a person holds something they have chosen and intend to keep. No flinch, no calculation, no distance measured or exits catalogued or latches weighed. Here's what I want you to remember about Kent Reeves and Violet Carter. Not the kiss, though it was beautiful. Not the rain, though Lord knows they needed it. Remember the knocking. Remember the months and months of doors he didn't open without asking. Remember the plate set down, the glass offered, the hand that stopped itself 6 inches short and found the table's edge instead. Remember that love didn't arrive the night she told him her truth on the porch. It arrived in every small safety he'd built around her, one ordinary day at a time, until the woman who'd been erased felt whole enough to write her own name on someone's heart. "Come inside," Violet said. She tugged his hands gently, and he went. She left the door open behind them. Rain fell on the porch, on the yard, on the cracked earth that was learning the way everything and everyone learns. Slowly and with great effort, how to be soft again. The lamp in the window burned steady against the gray morning, not to hold back darkness, but as welcome, as promise, as proof that someone was home. And in a small homestead on the edge of a valley that had nearly forgotten what green looked like, a family walked inside together, and the door stayed open, and the rain kept falling, and it was enough.